everyone, to this episode of Freedom Hub's Working Group. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Froman. We're sponsored by the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom, and we'll take a peek at that. We are the Disruptors Intersection, so we are trying to unite everybody that's out there trying to get a better world and be entrepreneurial, which is typically part of that process. In the same vein, we have a secondary show that's on the evenings of Wednesdays Eastern. We'd certainly encourage you to come take a look. This is the link to see the archived episodes. And as I said, we have the same website, but two ways to get there. There's two domains, the full one and then the truncated one. Let's take a quick peek there for a second. Zip over here. You'll see when you get there, there's a variety of drop downs to peek at. Under the first one, you'll see it says webinars, which is today. Continuing the conversation, let's take a look at that first, because that's really one of the important ones. Is after we've had this conversation, you might want to start to do a little follow-up. And so here's your chance to connect with any of the guests from the past, to know how to get involved with them on an ongoing basis, not just to take a nice warm shower with them one time with us here on an afternoon. So you'll appreciate that. Also, when you're on the webinar page, if you hover over webinars and you get on that page, you'll realize when you scroll down, let me get over there myself for a minute. Okay, here we go. If you scroll down near the bottom, you'll get past the description today. We'll come back up to this. You'll see a little list of guests that are coming up, so you can get prepared for them. And then here are the links to see where we post it. So every weekend, the episode is posted on all of these channels. Pick your favorite one. I'd encourage you to join all of them. We love the subscribers, helps drive traffic. Here's an example of the Brighteon page. And so you'll notice there's a wealth of great videos, and really, sadly, some of them could be a year old and there's current as yesterday. So you'll certainly want to come and scope some of this stuff out. And anything that gets you hot and bothered, you can come back to continue the conversation and connect with that person. So there you go in that regard. And let's take a look at what today's guest brings for us. So I'm going to back up here to this little section, and here's the description. So Charles, why don't you jump in here and give us a little rundown?
Gladly, Jeff and John, welcome back. For those of you who are regulars, you'll recall Mr. Berlau from his presentation a year ago or so. I mean, Jeff and I never can remember exactly when our guest presented it. We've been doing this now for a couple of years, at least every week. And a year ago, he presented on sort of socialization of crypto, the risks of letting government monopolize these alternative currencies, which are, as we all know, increasing in value the more we inflate and act irresponsibly fiscally. John is back not to talk about another financial deregulation topic, which is his expertise over at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, but rather about a history lesson that touches on some of his financial expertise, but more broadly speaking, entrepreneurship. Because it turns out that our founding president was a bit more than that one-dimensional profile on our quarters. John has a nice write-up. He goes, Washington was as interesting based on his entrepreneurship in various fields, which are really intriguing: hemp, mules, as what he called the fun founders, like Thomas Jefferson. I think that's a really, really good way to describe this, because that is true. Everyone loves Thomas Jefferson. He's the sexy, interesting, dashing, multifaceted founder. George Washington certainly isn't considered that way, but maybe he is. For himself, John got a start years ago as a journalist at the Washington Times, where he got an award for young journalist given by the Press Club, named after the son of Fox News' Brit Hume. That son's name is Sandy, and that strikes me because I met Sandy before he died at a mutual friend's house, and that mutual friend died this past year during the COVID mess. Whether his death really had anything to do with COVID is up in the air, but that was my best friend. And we had another mutual friend of mine. Brian Lloyd was an attorney, and he was interestingly the attorney for Roger Stone. And we had another attorney for Roger Stone recently, Tyler Nixon. So whenever I see a small world connection like that, I got to comment about it just because I can. After journalism there at the Washington Times and Investors Business Daily, John made his way to the Competitive Enterprise Institute, where he comments on all the deregulatory areas in finance and banking, the big banking bills, Graham, Leach, Bliley, Sarbanes-Oxley, et cetera. I'm sure I butchered the names, but lately money laundering and of course crypto. So with that, Jeff, we'll hear about our founding entrepreneur.
All right, sounds very good. John, I'm giving the screen over to you.
Well, thank you, Charles and Jeff. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here again at Freedom Hub. Now, yes, that's Washington isn't considered one of the fund founders, although today, as you may have noticed in this woke world, all of the founders are under assault. So just for doing a lot of the things the rest of the world, their world was doing at the time, and yet they're, and America in particular is sort of singled out for it. And so it's been an interesting time to write a book about any of the founding fathers and about Washington in particular. And even in the woke world, Washington has a lot of redeeming features. He was the only founding father who owned slaves to have freed all of the slaves that he owned outright. There were some that belonged to Martha's first husband and trust for her grandchildren that he couldn't, but he freed 124 of his slaves, sort of setting an example that abolitionists took hold of. So you can say from that, if you don't know anything else, that Washington believed in liberty. And my thesis in the book, I thought at first his entrepreneurship was a way to get to know him better, but I think that it confirmed working with different types of people, seeing the skills that different types of people, including the enslaved workers could do, were the things that convinced him that, of having, if not a completely consistent libertarian as we would know it today, consistent in his belief in human freedom and against government restraint. So I first heard about Washington's entrepreneurship about 10 years ago, or now over 10 years ago, when Mount Vernon would put in things that would be a tribute to his highlighted some of his business ventures. Now, Mount Vernon itself is a great organization. I had the pleasure of speaking to them a couple weeks ago. That is completely private, run by the Ladies League of Mount Vernon. Started in the 1850s by a group of women who didn't like the decrepit shape of Mount Vernon, and said, well, if the men can't do that, we can. So they raised money to buy Mount Vernon from his heirs and then do all of the restoration and all of the neat projects like the 4D theater and other things they have today at this interactive museum. And so it is a great entrepreneurial organization, and I would urge everyone to visit Mount Vernon, when they can. I live about 7 miles from it in Alexandria. They started building things like Washington's whiskey distillery and grist mill, and I'm just like, wow, I never knew that Washington was in whiskey, and could be something you could think of sort of as a fun, even to some people, sinful industry. And they have continued this over years with his other enterprises. When the laws with hemp are relaxed, they now again grow hemp at Mount Vernon today, and have mules, which Washington was one of the first mule breeders in America. So it's a great organization. So I started writing articles for Forbes, National Review, Reason, other places on Washington's birthday, and eventually St. Martin's Press expressed interest in this book, and I had to do a couple of drafts, but now the book came out just for the pandemic. So I've only had one in-person event, mostly virtual book tours, but I found that the book has been very inspiring. Other people have told me too about, having to, dealing with government tyranny in a lot of, and also, and how you fight against it, and also having with business how to restart that. I think the first thing to know about Washington is that while he wasn't dirt poor. His background, he was not as wealthy as many of the other founding fathers, such as Jefferson and Madison. And when when his father died when he was 11, Washington, didn't. His two older brothers had the bulk of the inheritance, so his family couldn't afford to send him to college, and he had to he did educate himself, but his education was largely self-education since he was a teenager. Now, one of the things we know about him now, we know both from his business papers and from his copious notes in his diary, is he read a lot more than people thought. That he read both books on agriculture, including by the British agriculturalist Jethro Tull, who is the namesake of the band. And Jethro Tull, one of the things that Jethro Tull's books was how to cultivate hemp. And so one of the mini chapters in my book, I was originally going to name it "How Washington Learned to Do Hemp from Jethro Tull," but the editor thought that may have been too cutesy or something, so I didn't think so. Washington also, it's firmly established, and it's only been so in the past 20 years that Washington did read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which laid the foundation of capitalism and against mercantilism, so much so that we have Washington, writing in the margin for some things in his copy of the book Wealth of Nations. So he was an engaged reader on many things. He would read books like Smith and John Locke, and also books about agriculture, and also just horsemanship, how to take care of horses, how to make jumps as a horseman. And Jefferson himself said Washington was one of the best horsemen he had ever seen, and a lot of Washington's skills have been attributed as a general, as president, have been attributed to experience, and which he did have, but Washington also was quite the avid reader, and if there was a book about it, he would read it. So he starts out when he was 11 at the gig economy job of its day, which is to be a land surveyor. He was a freelance land surveyor starting when he was about 15, and he went to different places in Virginia, mostly, including what's now the Shenandoah Valley area around Winchester, other places where this was all wilderness. He laid in 1749 at 16 some of the boundaries for what is now the city of Alexandria, when it was just starting as a town. And as a surveyor, he would pick up things about what land was going to be valuable, and would see things like what land is suitable for farming. And he both used his wages to buy land, and sometimes would get paid in extra land, say from the farmer or the landowner he was doing the surveying for. And it became very lucrative for him very fast, and he actually became a community lender from this, because he was getting paid, when he did get paid in cash, not in land, in the most sort of the newest and most current form of money, which there were sort of, as we were talking beforehand, there were alternative currencies in Washington's day, and one of the most common was tobacco warehouse receipts that would become a receipt for buying tobacco, for getting it from a warehouse, that would become like a national currency and just become traded in other transactions. So it sort of was the same function as crypto, when you couldn't trust, say, money issued by the colonies couldn't in particular issue money, and there weren't any mints in the colonies, so other things needed to be alternative currencies, and it stayed there when after the Revolutionary War, in the early days, when people just didn't trust some of the state money issued by the new states and other things. So we sort of, this is the thing, there's so many things about Washington's life that are relevant, but even when you get into things like crypto, there was an antecedent for that. Then after he was a surveyor, some things happened. His brother died. I think there were also some new taxes on surveyors, either by the state or Great Britain or both, that discouraged him. He was a colonel in the French and Indian War. He wrote about some of his experiences that were published in newspapers throughout the colonies, and actually sort of distinguished himself as a writer. It's funny because we don't think of him as a writer, like say Jefferson and Franklin, but at the time, I mean, that's sort of where he got this first touch of fame. He then courted and married Martha Dandridge Custis, who was the widow of one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, and that certainly helped him out. Although I think there is evidence that they did love each other. There's plenty of evidence of that. And so they went to. He would also get buy some of Mount Vernon, even though he didn't directly inherit Mount Vernon. And then he got some others when his brother Lawrence, his older brother Lawrence, had passed. But at the time he was getting that, there was a big tobacco glut. That it was the main cash crop. Everybody was selling it to Great Britain. There were all these duties there. It was mostly a product for export, and because of the trade laws, you could only really export it to Great Britain. And so he also thought correctly that it was ruining the soil at Mount Vernon. So and then he noticed that some of the smaller farmers, like the German immigrant farmers, were having success selling wheat in the domestic market. So he decided if a small farm could do this, maybe a big farm could do this too. And so he, over the years in the 1760s, just in a period of like say 2 or 3 years, converted all of the farm to wheat, hemp, and other crops, and was a pioneer of crop rotation. Now he would grow hemp at Mount Vernon through his death in 1799, and there's some letter that's it's off quote. It says always plant hemp when there's as a staple crop, and it's true. Some people have exaggerated, but some people have underplayed this. It's true. There's no evidence that he ever smoked the hemp in any form. At least there isn't evidence now. One of the things I learned is that there is, history happens all the time when a new letter or something is discovered, and they still are. But also, I mean, he did grow. It was one of his main crops, and he used it from everything to make rope to making the fish nets, which was a big part of his enterprises, where they would use the fish nets to do thousands of fish, like with shad and herring, and sell those. And then he would integrate his enterprises by using the fish guts for fertilizer. And then with the wheat, what he was growing, which was his main crop, he built a grist mill, and which is using that for flour. And he was able to, with legislation that he actually sponsored, but he sponsored for everybody as a member of the colonial legislature, the House of Burgesses, register the G. Washington name for the flour with the Fairfax County Courthouse, and use that as a trademark for branding purposes, just like H.J. Heinz would supposedly pioneer 100 years later. And the G. Washington brand of flour was shipped throughout the colonies to the British West Indies and to Great Britain, so that he had an international brand back in that day. And that may have been one of the reasons he was so well known, that Adams, in addition, when nominating him to be the general to lead the Continental Army, John Adams, in addition to citing Washington's military prowess, mentioned his independent fortune. So there's still sort of a mystery of how all of the other people of the Continental Congress knew him in an age where you didn't really have mass communication or knew of him so well. And I think given the fact that he was a businessman with a brand, may have had something to do with this. Now, during this time, Washington also ran into the heavy hand of government, and not just through the Tax Act all the taxes, the Stamp Act, and other things that we know about, or that, have been highlighted. He was also facing, as other colonial manufacturers were, the British regulation that basically outlawed a lot of manufacturers. There was the Iron Act of 1750 that said it was fine for the colonists to mine iron because there wasn't any in Britain and ship it to Britain, but they couldn't make finished goods out of iron, including like sickles or nails and things like that. And Washington was making this stuff at his one of his other enterprises was the blacksmith shop, where he was making horseshoes and nails and other things. And so he was really, as the British were starting to enforce these laws, just as they were the taxes, we really became worried about, could they actually seize his, what he was building. And he wrote, there is a letter that he wrote to George Mason, fellow colonist, and who would become a fellow founding father in 1769, saying that if Great Britain can order me to buy goods of them loaded with duties, they may also, quote, forbid my manufacturing. Note the words me and my in that sentence. Washington was speaking about threats to his personal enterprises, business ventures that had only been startups a few years earlier, and Washington was perceiving direct threats to his new manufacturing he had built to escape dependence on tobacco trade. And historian Woody Holton of the University of South Carolina actually called the British taxes the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back on the top of the, quote, heavy tax already paid, quote, to Britain in the form of the costly monopoly on their trade and the regulations accompanying these mercantilist policies. So, the history of Washington is nominated as general and then serves, and then 1781, voluntarily gives up power. And then he did a lot of interesting things as far as in between the time that he was retired as general and was president, including starting a mule business, where he had heard about mules in Europe. There were none in America. And that was really the genetic engineering of its day, when you did a male jackass donkey versus with a female mare. And he used some of his French connections, the Marquis de Lafayette, who was an ally of his in the war, and sort of was like, Washington saw him as kind of like a son and became one of his top aides in the war, and would put so I think Lafayette got him some European donkeys that he would merge with mares, and then would start selling mules. And even today, Washington, and there are some mule enthusiast groups, was known as the father of the American mule. And when you didn't have these mechanical plows, the mule would do the trick, and more than a horse-drawn plow would. And so Washington was also, he invented some things itself, like some more sophisticated plows, and tinkered around, but he also took under his wing, even before he became president, some inventors, and championed their inventions, including that of James Rumsey in Bath, Virginia, what is now Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, who invented what's credited as one of the first steamboats 20 years before Fulton commercialized it. And people thought that it was before the age that inventors were really respected, and a lot of people thought that Rumsey was a whack job. But as soon as Washington gave him his endorsement of the product and praised it, then Rumsey was able, before the U.S. Patent Office, to get state patents in Maryland and Virginia. And then later he and John Fitch, after the U.S. Patent Office was created in 1790, were able to share the one of the first patents on the steamboat. So, as president, and I write more about Washington's private life, I don't think a lot of people have put Washington in the Hamiltonian camp, but he did side with Hamilton on a couple of things such as, fully paying debts and other things. And, we can debate the merits of that, but I don't think it's fair to say he was a full Hamiltonian. He never endorsed Hamilton's manufacturing plan fully. There are letters now where he says to Hamilton, I think, the bounties you want to pay businesses for certain things exceed the Constitution. And he never supported, though there isn't evidence that he spoke out against, he did not support Hamilton's manufacturing plan in Congress, and I think and it eventually died in Congress. And if Washington, I don't, there's still getting evidence on whether Washington would have campaigned against it, but we know if he had lent support to it, it may have probably passed. So we knew he disagreed with Hamilton on that, and so it's not clear. He certainly may not have been disagreed with Jefferson on a lot of issues, but he wasn't fully in Hamilton's camp as far as, like, say, industrial policy, other things. And Washington, what libertarians or the modern libertarian movement often talks about are in his farewell address, where he talks about entangling alliances and not becoming too close with any foreign power. And that's very important. But I think also in there is he basically has early warnings against the administrative state, and he actually warns of the danger of the spirit of encroachment, as he called it, where the executive branch would usurp the powers of the legislative branch and vice versa. And he talked about guarding against that. He may have remembered, the regulation without representation that Great Britain had issued. And then as he was after he left the presidency, that's actually when he built the whiskey distillery on the advice of his Scottish farm manager. And then he wrote to his Irish Catholic friend, Alexandria merchant John Fitzgerald, who had served under him in the Revolutionary War and then had been in business in the Potomac Canal Company. And John Fitzgerald thought it was a great idea, and Washington built that, and it became one of his biggest and most profitable enterprises. And it is now reopened at Mount Vernon. And the friendship with Fitzgerald, also with the Carroll family in Baltimore, showed, Washington championed the religious and ethnic minorities of his day. He gave a speech to a synagogue, the Toro Synagogue, which is still standing in Rhode Island, where he said he promised religious freedom, and said, we give to bigotry no sanction. And then also at the end of his life, this is because I think Commerce showed him that all people have talents and are special and shouldn't be constrained. He freed 124 of his slaves. One who had been his valet, he freed immediately, and the other were set to be freed at Martha's death, and then Martha actually freed them a year after Washington died. She freed them early, and also provided old age pensions for them, as well as for their education. So an extremely I don't want to the word progressive has been perverted, but I'd say a far-sighted step for the day. And it was you can trace back where he is seeing with the distillery, with other things, he is seeing that he wrote a letter to a British agriculturalist where he said, quote, blacks are capable of much labor. And he saw that slavery was holding them back and holding their talents. And Mount Vernon has been doing more research, and some of the slaves that he freed would go on and start their own businesses and start, some of the black communities, free black communities in Alexandria. So there's lots more research to be done there. But I think both the Washington's business enterprises both show another side of his greatness. his genius, which is different from, but in some ways is just formidable, as Jefferson and Hamilton and Franklin and some of the other founding fathers celebrated, to the extent they're celebrated. But also it's a way to understand him, that he had setbacks and could come back from that, just as entrepreneurs today. And again, I thank Charles and Jeff for letting me talk about my book, George Washington Entrepreneur, available if I can do some on websites and where books are sold. I just autographed a copy at the Barnes and Noble in Springfield, Virginia, the other day, and I've done it other Barnes and Nobles, and it's available at book sites and bookstores across the country. And if it's not there, ask for it. But I'll be happy to take questions now.
All right, fantastic. That was great, John, and what an interesting twist on knowing about him, as it were. And coincidentally, I just drove sort of near that area on my way back from a trip I just took. So we were thinking about maybe sticking our head in there, and now I'm sad we didn't at the time, but I'll go back. I see some hands up, so anybody else, please raise yours. Charles, why don't you kick us off?
Gladly, Jeff and John, fantastic presentation. Two in a row. Good job.
Thank you.
So let's push a bit more on this Hamiltonian accusation that libertarians like to level at Washington. It's good to see some evidence from you that he didn't support Hamilton's report on manufacturers, corporate welfare, and you say that if he had supported Hamilton there, it might have passed, and it did die. What about the big one, the Hamilton's bank? Jefferson fought it, he lost. Hamilton won. Washington agreed to it. It was killed in the early 1800s, but that's sort of still a controversy today. Central banking, Ron Paul and the Fed. Do you have any thoughts on George Washington and Hamilton on that First National Bank?
Well, that was one I think Jefferson had it right on, although I wonder, and I'd like to see some research. I don't think you have something where even the first bank was not like issuing a monopoly on was not there to issue a monopoly on currency. I think it was sort of there to pay, as the way Hamilton proposes, a more efficient way to pay the government's own debts, and not, certainly was not. Did not get into the extent of having a monopoly currency, and although it may have, any central bank tends that way. So I don't know that it was as invasive as the Fed. So I think, well, he was wrong on that. He could be slightly forgiven for that. The other things, frankly, I think Washington, as far as paying, full value on the bonds, and on not siding with France, I could actually think that you could say Washington may have taken the libertarian position with France. He didn't get too involved with a foreign power. He let when it was in our interest to deal with Britain, even though we had fought from them, he let bygones be bygone. That could be seen as sort of being non-interventionist in a way. And on the speculators, I think, Smith and others think speculators are good things. They gave the farmers immediate and those who fought in the war immediate cash, and took the risk that they might never be paid. So I think you can say that, that it would be good for the U.S. to pay, the debt that's specified in its contract. So yeah, Washington wasn't a perfect libertarian, but he recognized, I think, the importance of property rights and the dangers of government intervention.
Very good. Very good. Charles, did you have a response to that? I think your hand was still up.
Yeah, I put it back up. There's two more. I might as well get them out of the way. The other two areas, and I think you're right about the non-interventionist point. I think a lot of libertarians might say Washington was better than Jefferson on the jingoism with France and England. I think Washington was more neutral and kept us out of supporting either, better than even Jefferson. So Jefferson was the lesser libertarian with the potential of war in the 1790s. What about patents and the Whiskey Rebellion? I know a lot of libertarians today think intellectual property is run amok. I don't know if the trademarks and patents in the Constitution rise to that level of concern that we have today. Number one, and number two, with his whiskey venture, how does that tie into his collusion with Hamilton against the Western Pennsylvania whiskey farmers who rebelled, the Whiskey Rebellion? So those two libertarian concerns.
Okay, let me get the answer your second question about his whiskey ventures and the Whiskey Rebellion, and because that's the simple answer. As far as that, how does it tie into? It doesn't. Washington was not into whiskey or did not make whiskey until after he was president in 1798, in the last 2 years of his life. So there was no conflict of interest as far as the Whiskey Rebellion. Whether you think he was right or wrong there. And I would say, I mean, the Whiskey Rebels, they were breaking the law, even if it was an unjust law. So it was, you can argue about how he did it and whether, that it was at least, I think, a legitimate use of government. And Washington did, pardon some of the organizers, I believe, after that. So I don't know. You could have a disagreement with exactly how he handled it. And I guess what was the other? Was there one other question in there, or?
The intellectual property issue. I think people today think special interest corporations have abused intellectual property. I don't know if that modern concern around IP applies really to the patents or trademarks that were involved in Washington State. That also may be apples and oranges, not really a comparison. But what if you had any thoughts on that?
Well, Washington was concerned about individual inventors, and I know there are issues, and it can be an issue like to divide libertarians with some saying there are no patents, but I think as Washington envisioned it, the patent was something so that, for limited times, just as the Constitution said, inventors could be secure in their property, so that it would give incentive for them to invent. And then there's Ayn Rand saying, what's more your property than what comes from your mind. So, I mean, I know some of the complaints about patents have been that, businesses can, ride roughshod over individual inventors and other things, and, misuse or take patents or block inventors from getting patents. So there's a whole thing, but I think it certainly is consistent with what a lot of libertarians believe, as far as the giving inventors, the creators, people like James Rumsey with the steamboat. I mean, Washington also, he gave speeches praising inventors and welcomed, like, say, balloonists to America. And this is another example of, as far as I know, he said one day they might be coming from Paris by, quote, flying through the air. So I think that's certainly consistent with what a lot of libertarians would think, even if there's division among libertarians about whether and what type of property rights they are.
Very good. Any other questions that we have here for John? Please raise your hand for sure. I was going to say, of all the different things that he did throughout his life, was there any one thing that he did really all the way through that he just kind of continually engaged himself in?
Yes, I would say yes. Well, there were a lot of things he continually did through. I mean, you could say sort of managing, or making this a better and stronger country. But he never stopped, even though he stopped being a professional surveyor at 17. He would always be surveying the different land he owned, and just about changes in the topography and other things, including he did his last survey of Mount Vernon 5 weeks before he died in 1799. So that's and then, of course, he knew what the battlefields would do, and things like the Second Battle of Trenton, when they went through rain or snow, or famously crossing the Delaware. That was his knowledge there. One of the things he asked for appropriations for in the Revolutionary War was to have hire professional map makers, the cartography of its day, because he knew how important maps and surveying were. So, I mean, he's sort of a lifelong surveyor. And I got to talk to the Surveyors Association, which is still, there's a lot of surveying going on. That Angie's List, recommends you get a survey, every time you buy a new house, or you have or do a survey of your home, and every time it's sold, because so many boundaries are changing because of things being built. That's something, I mean, Jefferson did some surveying too. And so a lot of, as well as Lincoln, and to some extent, even Teddy Roosevelt and the Amazon. I mean, who of course is not a libertarian, but so you could say the 4 guys on Mount Rushmore are 4 people who did surveying at some time in their life. And Washington this was something where the surveyors today have not gotten the woke virus and are still honoring him.
Fantastic. What a great story. Charles?
One thing that we exchanged a bit, John, in the run-up to this event with the social media promotion, was the fact that, where I grew up in Suffolk, Virginia, is in Southeast Virginia, is next to the Dismal Swamp. And we have historical markers there that George Washington spent some dough digging canals towards Lake Drummond. And this is a gigantic swamp that crosses the border into North Carolina, with the purpose of, cutting down trees and barging them up the canal for, I guess, delivery through Constance Wharf there in the Nansemond River, and up the Chesapeake, probably around the Norfolk, or shipment elsewhere in the colonies and stuff. And I guess you did some digging and found a bit more about that at the Mount Vernon sites. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, I would just say, yeah, Washington very much, believed in canals and, connecting the different places. It was sort of harder to go to some place like, to Western Virginia in his days than it was to go to Europe, because there were no roads and all of the rocky things. And before the railroads, which were powered by steam, which Washington also had a role in, I mean, it seemed like, improving the rivers so you could go upstream would be the best thing. And actually there was connection with Washington made James Rumsey, when he saw his mechanical boat, which would become the steamboat. He made him, superintendent of the Potomac Canal Company. So where Rumsey had time to practice on the Potomac River, so that, Washington was sort of, doing what he could to sort of integrate those things, with his business, with, the business of improving transportation for the country, and although was careful of conflict of interest. So I believe, he was involved in the Dismal Swamp, the James River Canal, and the Potomac Canal, as an investor there. So, that was very much, and the timber, some of these things, again, there are thousands of Washington kept business receipts and invoices and orders since he was 16, and protected them very carefully, even on the battlefield. There are still things of his that have not been put online. I mean, a lot of it is in the Mount Vernon Digital Encyclopedia and Founders Online. And the University of Virginia and Mount Vernon hope to be finished with all of his papers being put online, like I think by the end of this decade. But there are still always new papers being discovered. So there are still things we're trying to find out about Washington's business ventures that haven't been discovered.
What a great little conclusion there. That was great. John, this was such a good enlightening little
wait a
day.
minute. Did Jane had a question I see in the
Oh, you do? Oh, yeah,
box.
Jane. Oh, please, Jane, go ahead, unmute yourself if you do. Didn't mean to.
I don't think her mic is working, but she asked John how GW would think about cryptocurrencies if he were alive today.
I wrote this in the book, and I really think he would love them, because he would be familiar with them for 3 reasons. One, he was familiar with encryption, that he used invisible ink with some of his spies during the war. That's, in Brian Kilmeade's book, the Secret Six, and in that AMC series Turn. So he knew, I mean, they had encryption in the day, and Washington kept, detailed ledgers, and was very good at math, wrote about math. So you being the blockchain being a giant ledger, he would love that. And Washington, of course, was familiar with alternative currency from the tobacco warehouse receipts and other things. And of course, digital currency would be a lot more convenient. So I think he would be very, very happy with that. So I think, he would use and be very friendly toward cryptocurrencies.
Great. Well, what timely situation and commentary based on where we are on cryptocurrency today in particular. So that's pretty neat. So John, thanks so much for today.
Thank you so much for having me to talk about my book, George.
Yes, which we definitely are encouraging everyone to get about 5 or 6 copies because you need to give it out when you're out at dinner parties and stuff. So there you go. Excellent.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, John.
Okay.